So my name is Christine Miller. I'm the Vice Chair of the Academic Senate, and I'd like to introduce the panelists for today. First, since it's all about our students, I think the first one who should be introduced is Talar Alexanian, Student Trustee of the CSU. Second, you can applaud for her. Second, we have the Chair of the Board of Trustees, Lou Monville. Our Chancellor, Tim White. Our keynote speaker this morning, Suzanne Mettler. And ASCSU Chair, Stephen Filling. So the purpose of this panel is for the panelists to have a conversation about issues that you all filled out on these little cards that we went over and chose some of the cards. But before we get to those questions, I'd like to open it up for just a couple of minutes of opening statement if anyone would like to say anything. It's not required, but we really would like to get a conversation going among the panelists. And so I'll invite them to say anything that they'd like, beginning with Talar.
Well, thank you, Christine, and it's a pleasure to be here at a conference entitled It's All About Our Students and representing our 446,000 CSU students alongside my distinguished panelists and our author over here. Here at the CSU, we pride ourselves on really serving a body of students that come from a vast abundance of ethnicities, cultures, socioeconomic backgrounds, and historically underrepresented communities. And the CSU student is hardworking. He or she is resilient. They are working multiple jobs to put themselves through school and be the first in their families to graduate from college. 76% of us receive financial aid, and about 51% of us who are BA or BS graduates have $0 in loan debt. This is a huge feat. This diversity is what makes our campuses so vibrant and keeps us striving to implement programs and initiatives to meet our core mission to provide that access to an affordable and quality education. It makes me proud to be a part of the CSU. Yet the free fall in state funding for the CSU between 2008 and 2012 and the slow pace of recovery from that time has negatively affected students. Costs have gone up as we increasingly carry the state burden. Our friends and family members have been turned away due to lack of funding, and buildings on our campuses are aging and in a poor state of repair. These are obvious signs of the state's neglect, but I'm also concerned about the not so obvious damage to the CSU students' ability to serve us. We cannot continue shifting the burden from the state to the students and their families, and we need the state to recommit to the California State University. We need legislators to stand with the CSU, and we need to create a lasting political coalition that will minimize the fallout from our next economic downturn. And higher education is truly a bipartisan issue, and I hope that we'll be able to work together to truly let our legislators see that in this upcoming year. Thank you.
I have to follow that? Well, I actually think that what Talar said is the reason that brings all of you here today. And on behalf of my colleagues on the Board of Trustees, I want to take a moment to first thank all of you for the work that you do every day and the dedication that you show to our students. It is the academic core of this institution that is the core of this institution and that propels our success, whether it be in the academy or in the classroom. And as someone who is a product of your hard work, I'm gonna out somebody right now. I saw Jenny Zorn earlier, who would have to admit she knew me when I was a student. You know, I'm a product of your hard work, and it's not often that our board gets to say in a formal setting in a gathering of you all, thank you, and I want to thank you for your hard work. I will say, I think what Talar highlighted is the core that we as an institution grapple with, and that is finding our way to serve our mission and to serve our students in what are difficult and changing economic times. The challenge of continuing to have a higher level of accountability, which I think we all think is healthy, to improve graduation rates, to improve student outcomes, and really measure learning gains. All are going to be valuable to the state and to the future of this economy. Not to mention the social mobility of our students and their families. But how do we do that in a resource-constrained environment? How do we do that on a go-forward basis, recognizing the terrible deferrals that we have behind us? For those of you that enjoyed the trustees meeting for the last 48 hours, you heard a lot of that discussion. And as we grapple with those challenges, I think the message that I would deliver is I don't think there's any shortage of good ideas or bad ideas. And I think the dialogue about what are the ideas and what are the opportunities that will serve us well are important that we all have. What are the innovations that we can bring both to the classroom and to the system that are going to improve student outcomes? What are the opportunities and the best practices that are happening on individual basis on campuses that we can scale up and take system-wide? The CSU has been a role model to the nation for years. I want us to continue to hold that as a guiding principle, to be the role model and to serve our students and to show the rest of the nation how to serve those who that many other states don't. I look forward to the dialogue today. And again, thank you for your service to our students.
Thank you, Chris, and let me offer my thanks to everybody as well for this conference and the good discussions that have ensued, and our guests who've come afar to share with us their thoughts about this. I think I could reiterate in different words what Talar and Lou have said, but I won't. I also want us to be proud of what we actually are accomplishing. I've been in higher ed for quite some time. I know some think too long, but some of the discussions about being resource constrained and high workloads and decaying facilities are ones that have been every year in my 43 or 44 years of public higher education. And so while they're very real issues, they're not new issues. And sometimes we can preoccupy our discussions and our deliberations and our worries about those issues. And I would never want to minimize their importance. But we rarely stop and talk about our successes. And sometimes they seem like inappropriate marketing ploys for an academic organization to be doing. But the fact that there's this 3 million button on many people's lapels and hanging out on the parking lot stanchions is something for us as a organization, as individuals, students, faculty, staff, trustees, philanthropists that support us, the business community that hires our students, to be really very proudful of. It's a big number because we're a big system. I got that. But 1 in 10 people who are employed in this great state of ours have passed through your classrooms as faculty and through your facilities as staff, and were students once and are now alums. Nobody can come close to that. And a number that recently has been verified that's numerically not as impressive, but factually is stunning, is that 1 in 20 people in the United States of America who have a college degree have a degree from the California State University. 5% of America's college-educated populace are CSU graduates. So when we talk about the importance of our work, despite all of the headwinds that were just mentioned, political, economic, facilities, infrastructure, et cetera, let's never lose track of the fact that we also have enormous, powerful successes. And that when I was thinking of Suzanne's comments earlier today, she gave an eloquent presentation of the issue of the society that has been historically not served by public or particularly private and definitely for-profit predatory organizations. We are the antidote to that. Education is the antidote to the ills that face society, whether they're social or health or economic or environmental. And the derivatives of those, the interface between those and possible combinations and permutations become endless. But at the core, to solve and prevent those anomalies and to solve them when they exist is education. So never lose track, it seems to me, of the fact that while we work hard with our trustees, who I thought in the last 2 days did heroic work grappling with very difficult policy issues, or whether we're taking on folks in Washington, D.C. or Sacramento, taking them on not as a combative sense, but taking them on in a sense to inform and educate, to have them realize why this organization matters more than any other in the state of California for its social structure going forward, its economic vitality, and its environmental sustainability.
No, I think I've already had the floor enough, so I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Good morning, all. Again, if Lou got to remark, do I have to follow that? I guess I get to say that 4 times. I think one of the really important things for me is that we understand this process as discussions toward a consensus of one sort or another, rather than a very direct search for solutions. I think we often find ourselves in very strange places because we look for the Band-Aid to put on the ill of the moment rather than dealing with the underlying issues. One of the biggest underlying issues, our students have kind of complex lives. I think a good example of that might be the president of CSSA, who had to resign because of his complex life. There are a number of our students who have to leave because of their complex lives, and I think our goal is and should be to find ways to bring them back to enable them to stay, and that the longer-term solutions precisely revolve around that. One of the things I noted from both Kevin and Suzanne's presentations was where you come from matters. If I recall correctly, there was a pretty strong correlation between income level and progeny's ability to graduate from school. For a long time, the CSU has had the mission of reversing that trend, and I think perhaps when we start to have those longer conversations about resources with folks in Sacramento and elsewhere, maybe that's the point we need to emphasize. As our Chancellor says, we do have some pretty sterling successes, and we should find probably better ways to talk about them. Most especially better ways to change the discourse. I think that when we talk about higher education as, well, here's the job you can get when you get a degree, we really cut ourselves off at the knees. Our discourse needs to be about the public good of higher education. The fact that in addition to getting a decent paying job, you can have vastly increased possibilities. You can be a much more active and knowing participant in the society we live within. That discussion, I think, would be worth having.
Thank you. I have some questions for the panelists that were called from the work that you folks did, and I appreciate that. I wanted to tell you, though, that when we were going through the questions to determine which ones we thought would be, there were too many to use, obviously, we found that there were student questions that were rising to the top. And the way we know that is that many of the students actually signed their cards, which was nice. So not that other people don't ask intelligent questions, but it was striking to us when we were going through these questions that the ones we liked were the ones from the students. So let me start with one. Reflecting on the talks given by Finneran and Mettler, what innovative opportunities do you suggest can be offered to restore the public purpose of higher education and further graduate well-rounded and globally responsible students in the CSU system? So innovative opportunities, reflecting on the things that have been said this morning and yesterday, ways that we can take what we've heard about today and go forward into the future. What kinds of things can we do?
Great. Well, that's the big question. Um, and I think that part of what's necessary is a wake-up call in our society. I think that in the United States, if you look at public opinion research going way back and how people answer all sorts of questions about what they support government being involved in and spending their tax dollars for and so on, as Americans really support education, both K-12 and higher ed. And when I started my project, I wondered, when I looked at the fact that we're not supporting higher ed as a society as much as we did in the middle of the 20th century, I thought, well, maybe public support has changed. When I looked at the public opinion data, that's not the case. The public is at least as supportive as ever, I think more so, really, of education. People are also becoming more aware of rising economic inequality. And when Americans think about what should we do about that, the first thing that tends to come to Americans' minds is education. So I think that the first thing that's needed to create an opportunity to make a change is to really highlight these issues and to make it clear how these things relate. Because I think that most people are really unaware. When I go around and speak to audiences, I know it's not new to any of you to hear that public funding has deteriorated, but that is a big surprise to a lot of the audiences that I speak to. And I think that in higher education, most of us who work in it, we believe in it and we just keep doing what we're doing, but we haven't been articulating that to the broader public, the value of it. I don't think it takes a lot to do that, because people who have themselves benefited from higher education and from public higher ed in particular, once that case is made to them, I think can readily come on board. But I think that we need to think about making that case and articulating it to the broader public more clearly and forcefully.
I think just another minor thought maybe, is to make certain that we remain grounded in our DNA of an organization that never makes excuses and should always be prideful of who we include, not who we exclude. And so if that is a premise, a bedrock of the CSU, then I think we back calculate the innovations from that bedrock. So I would never say that we should ever lower the bar for our students in terms of the knowledge they learn in their discipline and the skills they learn of cultural competence, of communication, of problem solving, of teamwork, of social networks, both virtual and in face. But if we say we are inclusive, then we have to recognize that some students come to us from a point of opportunity, if not privilege, and enter the institution here, and in their time with us, their rate of ascent would be something like this. But other students enter the organization from some other level of opportunity or of income, as was pointed out so eloquently earlier this morning in Suzanne's presentation, or from schools that are underperforming, or a whole myriad of issues. And we expect them to get to the same finish line, but they're starting somewhere else. So their slope of ascent is here. And so I think the great innovation that we have in front of us yet to articulate and do at scale, but are probably doing in individual places, is how to personalize the education in the world's largest baccalaureate, master's, and doctoral institution. Because if we don't personalize it, we're going to do sort of things on average, and we don't have an average student. We have a variety of curves. And so our chance to innovate is the way we go about the judicious and appropriate and new use of technology in ways to individualize the education and the learning environment. I think we have opportunities to also think about how we never stop on the challenge side, but perhaps more importantly, think about the support and encouragement side. That's one of the reasons why, as we're celebrating the retirement of Ephraim Smith in this building and moving to the next chief academic officer, by whatever appropriate words it is that we're integrating student affairs with academic affairs, because it's my firm belief that there's a great innovation to think about the combined environment of learning, both physical and virtual, in ways that rather than, oh, that's a student affairs issue, oh, this is an academic affairs issue. And so I think there's going to be some really great opportunities for innovation in that integration of the learning environment in which our students learn, in which our faculty teach and do the creative activity and the discoveries that they do in their research activities, and in the environment in which our staff provide the necessary support so the creative side can function. So how we go to innovation in a way that there is no silver bullet, but that there is a new way in which we remain inclusive, recognize the varying backgrounds of our students, and stay firmly committed to not marginalize those who, for reasons beyond their control, have not had opportunity, have all the intellect in the world, but have not had opportunity until they're with us. And then we have the opportunity to help them, their families, and their communities achieve at a much higher level.
Okay, I'm going to take the prerogative to ask the next question because I think in some ways it's related. The two answers that I heard were very good at articulating that we need to innovate, etc. The question then I think becomes how. And there are a couple of people who I'm combining two questions here because they both get at the same thing. Going back to the point this morning about political polarization, if the greatest challenges are related to political polarization, and if our hope is in some political advocacy, how can the CSU become better in its advocacy? And relatedly, how do we leave the tower to lead public reconsideration on these issues that have been discussed this morning? How do we stop just adjusting to the environment and effectively change the environment?
I think we've already embarked on one way to do that. The 3 million buttons people have and the associated websites, I think, are a marvelous first step in that direction to acknowledge that, as Tim says, 1 in 10 people in California with a degree came out of our institution. We need to find some way to help them carry that forward. And I think, reinvigorating that gets us out of the tower, and it gets us out of the tower with obviously 10% of the population. So there's a good place to start.
I think the work to be better advocates for the system has already begun. I don't think it should be lost on any of us. While we may not have been pleased with the ultimate result, for the first time in my recollection of observing 20 years of California politics, you had more than 80% of the legislature sign a piece of paper on the dotted line saying, I support an additional $95 million of funding for the California State University. That's a seminal change in California's legislature and a change in the debate about the importance. I think the second part of Christine's question is probably the part where we are most challenged. And I say me as part of the we. The general public can't always synthesize and understand what it is we do in higher education. And we don't do a good job in explaining it to them in terms that they can grasp around the kitchen table. And so I think we have to think about my experience is the people who do the best job at talking about the value of a higher education are those people that are out on our campuses recruiting students and talking to those students and those families who don't believe higher education is an opportunity for them, because they have taken what you all know in the academy and what we do every day into the simple terms that they understand about changing the mobility of their family, about setting an example to siblings that if the oldest goes, the likelihood of your younger siblings going to college goes better. And I also think, and candidly, my sense is we have a resistance to translating the public good to the economic good. But I think we should not be ashamed to have that discussion and make that debate. Because I consistently hear when I'm in Sacramento, well, it's a revenue problem, right? We just simply don't have enough revenue. And it's a problem of how those revenues are chosen to be spent. That's one. But two, and equally as important, if it is truly a revenue problem, then show me an institution that gives back more in the form of revenue. Look, we generate, the average CSU graduate is going to generate 3 times the amount of personal income tax to the state of California over their lifetime than a high school graduate. I remember having a dialogue one time with a legislator, and I said, you show me somebody who gives more back, I'll take another cut. But I think we have to be able to distill it down to that kind of language that people understand. When your family's sitting around the table trying to figure out, is tuition the priority over paying the heating or the gas bill? We have to then take our value and distill it down to something that can equate into that conversation. And I think we shouldn't be ashamed to do that. And I think it does require us to maybe talk about the value of higher education outside of just the context of the public good, but then translate for someone what the public good means. And I think we should be willing to do that.
Well, I want to affirm everything that's been said and maybe just articulate things, similar things, but in a political science sort of way. I'm right now back at Cornell teaching the Intro to American Politics class, and one of the big puzzles that we always grapple with in political science is that the vast majority of people tend to not be mobilized around issues, even issues that they care about and have a really common point of view about. And higher education is a classic example of that. So, as I did the research for this book, I found, looking at the whole story of bank-based lending, that the banks were very mobilized and their lobbyists were active. And then around the for-profit colleges, their lobbyists were active. And then there are certainly the trade associations that represent higher ed, but and have their offices at 1 DuPont Circle. But there it's predominantly the private nonprofits that have, I think, the largest voice. And so the puzzle is, where is the broad mass public that really, according to these public opinion polls, believes in higher education, wants to support it, wants us as a society to really promote it? I'm intrigued to be hearing what you're talking about with these buttons, the 3 million buttons. I mean, I think that is the challenge about how to engage the public and to awake a giant, in effect, to be your alumni, really, for them to be your spokespeople out there and to be articulating to legislators the value of higher education here. So that's the first thing. And then the other, I really want to agree with what's been said about thinking of higher education as a public good. I was so struck in doing my research about how this is a long American tradition. If you go back to the Northwest Ordinance and look at the arguments that were being made early on in the United States about why national government, when it was doing very little else, we're barely getting the post office started at that point in time and a few other activities, begins to support higher education and giving land grants to states so that they could start to develop their universities. It was at that time articulated very much in the terms of we needed to develop a future leadership for the country, civic leaders. And, it sounds like that's very much what this system is doing here in California. And there are so many other ways in which higher education does promote the public good, but we these days tend to articulate its values very much as a private good, what it does for individuals and their families. And while it's undeniably both, it's also a private good. I think we make a real mistake in emphasizing the private good values over the public good.
I think Lou hit it on the mark when he said it's about how we tell our story. Because so many oftentimes when we go and visit with, whether it's legislators, whether it's individuals from your own campus, in your own communities, it's about explaining the work that we're doing on each of our institutions, as well as us as a system, and how that develops into the public good, as well as the private good. The fact that we were able to have access to a high quality education and translate that to going into the workforce and going into fields, whether it's nursing, being a scientist, those are all fields that channel back into the California economy. And I think it's important for us to see that and see the value and the return, the exceptional return on investment that legislatures will be making if they invest in us now in our system while we're still in school and getting that high quality education and making sure that we translate that as we leave and see that result in the upcoming years.
Thank you. One of the things that's historically guided us as in this system and the rest of California to get at that public and private good notion is the master plan. And so someone asked, do you think statewide higher education policy should be focused on the master plan for higher education, or should it be fundamentally altered?
Well, let me take a shot at that one. I actually think the concept of the master plan is brilliant. That California created a three-legged stool that allows a student to migrate during their time from one system to another to meet their needs and match their capabilities and their aspirations. The concern that's occurred, of course, is that the master plan has not been contemporized or resourced appropriately, and different elements now of it have different kinetics of students going through, and so there's some roughness between the sectors. I got in trouble with the local newspaper because I said it was like a metaphor, and then they wrote an editorial about me using the word like and metaphor, and said that if I was like any high school senior studying for the SAT, they would have known that my analogy was actually a simile, not a metaphor. You know, just the way it is. But I think where California has a policy issue is, in the simile, is freeway and on-ramps, is when we look at the increased resources and capacity, let's say in the community college system or in the K through 12 system, to create more students eligible for the California State University or the UC, yet the capacity for those those four-year systems remains constant, then all of a sudden you fill up the on-ramp, but there's no room at the end on the freeway. That was the simile. And I think right now we have, with the Prop 98 or 78, 98 funding and things of that nature, some of the lobbying issues that Suzanne so well articulated a moment ago, is that there's a disconnect between the rate of capacity building among the three segments, and certainly when you add the fourth segment, the K through 12 system. So I think this is a policy level that no single system or board of trustees or regents or visitors can fix. I think it requires highest level leadership in Sacramento to say the concept is valid. How do we make sure that we align efforts and align resources in order to meet, and we often hear that, oh, there goes CSU again, begging for resources for themselves. There goes UC, et cetera, et cetera. The truth is, we are not for ourselves. We're really building tomorrow's workforce and citizenry. We are the enterprise, the that allows that to happen. And so when we seek resources, it is really for the future. Now, I also feel strongly about self-actualization, and I never want to stop being critical of things that we're doing internally in how we deploy ourselves, the processes we engage. Are there more effective ways to distribute our existing resources to maintain a very high quality degree that's more effectively administered to today's and tomorrow's student body? And so part of this is to do the long-term policy work in the State House and in DC, but I also think being absolutely steely-eyed analytical of our own processes internally to see whether we can redirect our resources in ways that actually raise the capacity and get students to quality degree in a timely fashion. And it's going to be that combination of short-term with the long-term that ultimately will move us forward for the public good.
I think one of the issues with the master plan is indeed that tripartite structure and the fact that the public says, here's the little bit of the purse we'll give you, and effectively says, you guys fight it out over who gets what. And that leads to the resource contention that drives the problems we have. We most certainly can, as the Chancellor notes, be more effective, more efficient, if you will, at what we do. However, I feel the need to inject the reminder that education is a humanist exercise. And when we talk about becoming more efficient, it's very easy to slip into industrial similes or metaphors, whichever is appropriate, and start talking about production structures. We need to keep firmly in the forefront of our brains that every one of those things we're producing is indeed a human with a very discrete existence and a very real value, which suggests that perhaps we need to engage in more of what Tim has already, I think, started to do, which is working with the CCC folks and the UC folks and trying, to the extent possible, to present a united face both to the folks in Sacramento and to the folks in the rest of the planet. I'm not sure how we continue that more effectively, but it seems like that's probably got to be the primary solution to, here, you guys fight it out.
Both of those answers mention the word resources, production structures, that kind of thing. I was very gratified to hear the word quality come out of the Chancellor's mouth too in that context. And so that's the next question. How do we avoid decreasing quality of education in an environment of efficiency initiatives and cost minimization efforts?
I'll start off this one. Well, I think students are at an institution to make sure that they are receiving that quality education. And I know right now we're having a lot of discussions on graduation rates and making sure that we're increasing that time to degree. And of course, the faster that we'll be able to graduate will turn us into the workforce and help us going on our careers and our next paths in our life. But I think we have to also make sure that the quality instruction we're receiving inside the classroom, as well as the support services outside the classroom, are maintained and increased and expanded so that we are being provided the best support we can while we're already in the institution. And I know one way to do that is through technology and the infusion of online education. I think we've seen how online education is expanding. It's increasing accessibility. It's increasing flexibility for many of our students who not necessarily fit the typical demographic of coming to school every day, but let's say have their own families, have full-time jobs, and cannot necessarily be in a traditional brick and mortar institution. And so online education definitely helps that aspect of students. But it's also important to remember that there is something very powerful to be in that classroom and campus experience that can't quite be translated online. And so really finding that balance of both and seeing online instruction, I think, as a way to increase our flexibility and have that as an enhancement, but not necessarily the end-all, be-all solution is important.
I certainly agree with all of that Talar has just articulated. When we think about what is education and what is it that we hope happens in the experience between professors and students and between students and each other while they're going through college, it's still so hard for us to articulate that or to pin that down. But it's certainly a process that defies speed ups or the kinds of ways of becoming more efficient that's possible when you're producing cars or radios or anything else of the like, where you can use technology to cut costs and things can get actually cheaper over time. So, in fact, economists would say that when it comes to education, like healthcare, costs necessarily go up as we are relying upon human beings with specialization to facilitate this process. And I think that we've been over the last couple of decades beginning to focus more on student learning, but it's really hard for us still to know how to assess it, how to measure it. And I think that when it comes to online education, that there are great opportunities there. I agree with Talar, but I think that our enthusiasm for it so far has been way out ahead of our understanding of appropriate pedagogies that make it work well. And so I think, we need to continue to think about how can we provide high quality education for a reasonable cost, and to figure out what parts of it can be reduced, but which parts really cannot be, particularly when we're trying to educate people to expand college graduation rates to people who come from less advantaged backgrounds and who haven't had all of the perks that enable them to take advantage of education as easily as those who come from more privileged backgrounds.
Well, Chris, I think you finally posed a question that is going to make us say some things that perhaps are more difficult. So I think about, and I talked yesterday with the trustees a bit about this, these 4 words that we use in the CSU and many other places in the country, although I think we're one of the first ones to add the 4th word. The hydraulics really between access, affordability, quality, and completion. Now, let's just think about this intellectually and logically for a moment. Not emotionally, not ideologically. You can't have degree completion without access, right? So now access then is access to what? Simply is, well, do I get into a campus or not? But when you think about it just for a moment longer, it's once you are admitted to a campus, do you access faculty? Do you access courses in the right sequence? Do you access health services and financial aid services and social services and all of the things that library hours, etc. So access has many levels to it. So then that sort of leads to the levels of access, the hierarchy, the taxonomy of access, then inevitably leads to what makes a quality experience. And a fundamental difference between training and education. There's an app out there for just about anything you need to find out a factoid on. And if that's what education was, then, we really could not worry about our crumbling physical infrastructure, because we could do it 100% virtually. But education is the context by which, the history by which, the perspective from different points in time and in culture and in geography as to how we understand the facts that we can get so easily. And that's where I think your point, Stephen, is valid, that we can't turn this into a commodity and be judged by X numbers of Y's in Z time. But we're also in a role of great accountability, and we have to be mindful of that. And so when we think about the accountability and the expression of outcome, we have to make sure that we are speaking on variables and that we measure variables that we value and not end up having to value things that somebody else wants to measure on us. And that is a very important point in our public and our internal conversations. The issue of quality, though, gets to the issue of price, because quality requires resources. And if we are only able to provide quality education to our students at an increasingly and exponentially or linearly growing cost to students and to society, that intellectually is not sustainable. And so our inevitable outcome would be that we have to stop one of two things. One is we have to lower quality, or two, we have to lower access. And that, I think, is the horns of the dilemma for public higher education. You know, I get asked which of those four words is most important, and it's a difficult one, but I think the one that we can never equivocate on is quality. Because if the degree and the process by which a student earns that degree is going to be worthy to her and to her family and to her community and to her multiple employers, whether they're here or somewhere else in the world, if that degree doesn't provide that quality, then we are nothing other than a facade. So if you buy into the fact that quality has to be added, and you buy into the reality that a continuing linear or exponential growth of cost to a public and to a person is not sustainable, we have to find ways to innovate and bend that cost curve without becoming a commodity, without excluding people from the fabric of society that need access to become very productive members. And I think that is a discussion that we just have to take on. You know, I have in my office upstairs two things that I often pull out sometimes in long conversations. One is a rearview mirror from a car that I hit with a hammer and broke it. So it's fractured glass. And sometimes a conversation will get going about the ways things were when I was a student in the Cal State system, and I will gently go get my fractured rearview mirror and I'll put it on the chair next to me, and pretty soon the person I'm having a conversation will say, "What's that?" And I'll say, "Well, look, I want to know what happened in the past, sort of. But I'm really much more of a windshield sort of way I think about life and think about this great system. And while ideologically, I wish it were the way it was when I paid $50 a semester, it's not. And will it go back to that? No. Is that selling out? No. It's the reality in which we are privileged to be part of this institution to serve our students of the times. And so how is it then that we think of ways with using, as I said, innovations judiciously and expeditiously, but not be afraid of them because they challenge perhaps the last way of doing things. Because otherwise we're going to decrease access and decrease those we serve, and that's at our peril and at society's peril and the public good peril. That to me is the rubric's cube that we've not yet articulated well or made sufficient inroads to solve. And CSU should have the courage to take that tough conversation on.
The summation, I think, of what the Chancellor said is what I was going to touch on. And I think we sometimes get trapped in the debate or the dialogue between, well, it's either quality or it's efficiency and innovation. And I don't think those have to be mutually exclusive. And I think as a dynamic and a place of learned dialogue and of education, I think we should be willing to have that discussion. Right? I mean, you know, the common phrase, well, how do you build a better mousetrap? Well, it's because someone thought the old mousetrap wasn't working right. And that's an okay discussion to have. It's also something that I know I can speak for my colleagues on the board. We're interested in seeing innovations, and we're also okay with risk. I mean, I think we recognize that as you all try to change the delivery of education in any number of ways, and I don't just mean technology. I think that's a part of the options out there. I don't see it as a panacea. I think it's an interesting option. But I think we need to recognize we're going to try some things that aren't going to work. But I think we also have to commit the resources to give you the ability to go and try and fail and or succeed. What do we do about providing resources for professional development? What do we do about providing resources for release time and creative time so that you can give it the thought and give it the diligence it needs before you bring it to the classroom? I think something that the Chancellor and the board has really focused on is trying to think about the fact that in a time of limited resources, if we want to see innovation and improvement in quality, that's a place we have to commit resources to see that happen. And I think to do that, though, I think we have to look at the opportunity to improve quality comes with innovation, and we should be willing to have the conversation of those two terms together.
And I think that conversation will continue beyond the bounds of this time and space and into our lives and our campuses. I think you probably heard the ship's horn on the Queen Mary tell us that we're done for the day. I want to thank you all for coming to the conference, and please join me in thanking the panelists for their time this afternoon.